Now I put the spotlight on you, Shannon. How are you? It's lovely to see you
Hey,
again.
hi. So good to see you. Thank you so much for this. I've been looking forward to this all day. It's great. Hi, Osprey. Long time no see. Osprey and I just, as she was talking about, we were in New York together. So, even though we live just across a small bridge, we don't see each other that often. We have to, cross the country in order to, get together. But or be on
Zoom
this
calls across the
calls from
country.
Australia in order to spend time together. So
That's
anyway,
right.
thank you for having me. Thank you for this awesome sort of whirlwind round the world look at things. It's very cool.
That's great. No, and I've been looking forward to it too. It's nice to hear about everybody's work. And again, for those who've just joined us, there are a few people just been coming in, and it's that kind of day. It's kind of a marathon. So we have nearly 200 people registered for the entire webinar, but people are coming and going throughout the day. So for a couple of folks who just joined us, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. Just to recap, we kicked off at 9 a.m. Australian time. We had an introduction to the rights of nature and the history of the movement and the work from Mari Margle. And we've had a wonderful hour listening to what's been going on in Ecuador with Natty from Ghana and with Hugo, who's a lawyer in Ecuador. We've had Osprey talking about the work of We Can and what I think is the really important work of linking a lot of the movements together with rights of nature. And now I'm delighted to introduce Shannon Biggs. Shannon and I and Osprey and several of us all met many years ago. And I meant to say this for the other introduction, but we were having technical difficulties and I was freaking out. But we all met back in 2014 in person in Ecuador when we met to really, I guess, progress some of the work of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature and when the first tribunal was developed. And Shannon's work has always connected with Indigenous friends and colleagues in the US. So I'm really looking forward to your update, Shannon. But yeah, over to you, 15, 20 minutes on whatever you'd like to share with us and your work. And if you want to sneak in any updates from your amazing times in New York for Climate Week, I just hit up Osprey to give us some updates. So given we're so far away and most of us don't like carbon miles, we're happy to watch you guys do that
Yes.
work. So thank you.
Well, we appreciate, yes, the carbon miles is definitely something we all had to think seriously about before we, jetted across the country from California to New York. But thank you so much for having me, Michelle. My name is Shannon Biggs. I'm the co-founder of an Indigenous and women-led organization called Movement Rights, which is based in Turtle Island, also known as Canada and the United States. Turtle Island is the name Indigenous people called the area where we live, long before it was uh, carved up into countries and states and things like that. And the work that we do at Movement Rights is, our motto, so to speak, is aligning human law with the laws of the natural world. And, that's, to me, I mean, rights of nature is we're sort of right in that bailiwick because, over here we have, how the human laws, this is earth in balance. And over here we have uh, human laws, which are spinning wildly out of control because they don't reflect the real laws of of the living earth. And like we sometimes say, there are real laws, to the way that we govern the system of life on this planet that connect us all. And colonization has created this separation and this idea that we are no longer part of nature, but that we are, in fact, that we're looking at property and nature as property and ourselves as separate from nature. And one of the things that, at Movement Rights and in our work in the United States or Turtle Island is really just also recognizing, I think you were just talking about that sort of rights to responsibility. And I think that is so right. I mean, that is so important because Indigenous people, no matter where you go, rights is a Western construct for sure, but let's say it's a placeholder. For Indigenous people, though, this is about our shared responsibility to one another, to the circle of life, to everything that is. And when we think about rights of nature, especially with Indigenous people work on Turtle Island, what tribes that are passing rights of nature laws are really conveying is they want to shift the law that exists from this rights of nature. So we'll give you rights of nature because it actually reflects an Indigenous cosmology about how to live in right relationship and balance reciprocity with all other living things, and reflects our enduring responsibilities as caretakers of the places where we live. And I think that when you see the rise of rights of nature internationally, when we first met, there were just a handful of places that had recognized rights of nature, and now it's over 30. Which is, we're scrambling as the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature and all these other, just to keep up with what's happening, which is really an exciting place to be. But at the same time, it really does, it is really shocking how quickly and this movement is emerging. So I'd just like to, since you've had a look at other places, I'm just going to stop for a moment and talk about what's happening in the United States with, and in particular, Indigenous leadership. My organization focuses on 3 pillars and sort of the best when they're all connected, which is Indigenous rights, rights of nature, and climate justice. So when we were in New York last week, we really had an opportunity to combine all of those things as civil society, as talking to ourselves and coming together as a movement, as well as at the United Nations. The gathering in New York was, really based around ending the era of fossil fuels. It was a call out from the UN Secretary General for this Climate Ambition Summit, which, is the UN talks about climate change a lot. They've been doing it for decades and decades. And yet here we are. And one of the things that's interesting, the fossil fuel as an industry is really responsible for like 75 to 80% of all emissions, global emissions into the air. So if we were to, we can't really stop climate chaos unless we, address that. But also, we have to call it out. And Indigenous people are really, really ready to do that, especially says it's Indigenous, Black, and communities of color that are the ones suffering the most. They're on the front lines of the refineries. They're on the front lines of fracking. They're where the pipelines are. Our board chair, Casey Camp Hornick, who's the ambassador of the Ponca Nation of Oklahoma, was the first to, their tribe was the first to recognize not just rights of nature in the United States as a tribe, but climate rights as well. And since then, it's been, and that was 2016 or 17. And now we have so many more tribes that are coming forward. And the reason that that's important, that it's tribes coming forward, is partially because they have a very different legal sort of standpoint, the way that they versus communities, but also because this is about Indigenous leadership in the climate justice movement. There's a reason why the Indigenous contingent leads the march. And that is that that recognize that people on the front lines are the ones with the solutions, and Indigenous people and that traditional cosmology is really what is sort of the keeper of that human relationship. So as we're moving forward around this legal recognition of rights of nature, we have to, we have to look at, how are we going to make this culture shift? Because, it can't happen in isolation. It can't just be about, oh, we changed the law and we're going to sit down and still do the same things. And Indigenous people in the United States are, have really been leading, like the land back movement, the Indigenous just transition movement, rights of nature movement, in a way that has far more, it's not just a legal change, it's about a shift in responsibility and coming together for everybody. And that's been a really important step in the evolution of rights of nature in the United States as well, because it didn't really happen so much with, the communities that first stood up, because it wasn't part of their, history or background. And in some cases, some of those conservative places thought being called an environmentalist was like the fighting words. So if we're gonna actually make the shift that needs to happen, we have to recognize the importance of Indigenous leadership. Rights of nature has been globally led by Indigenous people. It's not a mistake. In Ecuador, there are over 50% of the population are Indigenous. That's not the case in the United States. But so we have different work to do, and every place has different work to do. And it's really happening. The rights of rivers has been really growing in the United States, Indigenous led. There was something magical that happened at Standing Rock several years ago, when Indigenous tribes were trying to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline, and came together in a global awakening and a global calling for Mini-Wachoni, or water is life, and that they were willing to put their bodies on the line, because not just for their own tribes and communities, but for everybody downstream, and that we were all connected. And so this idea of rights of rivers and tribes coming together also to recognize rights of rivers is happening in a number of different places in the United States. We've just hired a plains organizer to begin expanding on the work that the Ponca have done in Oklahoma, in order to work with more tribes to begin to come together. Even those, not everybody's feels the same way about fossil fuels, including tribes, again, part of that colonial history. But the Ponca are very small. They can't, they have 1,500 miles of river. They can't pass rights of nature in one small spot in a fossil fuel epicenter and just imagine it's going to be fixed. So they're seeing the work as needing to bring other tribes together around these efforts. And then there are exciting things, like we're so excited to see the Mashpee youth ambassadors in New York. We had recently visited the Mashpee tribe, which is the tribe of first contact in the United States. So the history of colonization really started with the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, and their youth have worked with their tribe to recognize the rights of the rights of herring, which is a foundational food that they said, once upon a time, our ancestors could walk on the backs of the herring in the river, and the herring were the fish that brought all of the other fish and every other thing together into their community. So they recognize the rights of nature, which is, I think, one of the first times an Indigenous youth group has really led this work. But what's also really exciting is that they're working within the traditional regulatory structure to use that rights of nature law to rebuild natural pathways for for the herring. So there have been so many exciting, there's the Crystal Cavalier Keck from the Occaneechi Band of Saponi Nation in what's North Carolina are working on the first statewide recognizing the rights of the Haw River. There's so many. Nimipu has been working on the rights of the Snake River. So I think it's really been exciting to see how rivers in particular seem to be connecting tribes and communities together because it's something people get. The river belongs to us all.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And often when I reflect back on, I've been involved in watching and talking about and being involved in the movements around rights of nature for, I think, 12 years now. And for us in Australia, the moment when people really started to get it was when New Zealand and the Whanganui River, that was the first time, up until then, my understanding and my analysis had been rights of nature was being kind of introduced across a jurisdiction, whether it was a community or in the Ecuadorian constitution. And suddenly it was an ecosystem, suddenly it was in relationship with the river. And I was really taken by how people picked up on that. And even now, folks are super keen to do more in Australia and other places, even though we've already discussed how our legal system has got its own particular quirks and difficulties. So Shannon, it's lovely to hear. Can you tell me the name of the youth group? You said their name, but I don't know how to spell it.
Sure.
So, yeah.
I can put it in the chat too.
Yeah, that'd be grand. Yeah, thanks.
Mashpee
Youth
Ambassadors.
That sounds
and
amazing.
You can find them on the internet. You can find them on Instagram. They're just, it's great to see youth leadership in this way. And I was just, it's just stunning.
Yeah.
So,
and I think we've all got, our hearts go out to the young people with the future they face. So when they are standing up, it's very hard morally to argue with them, I think, when they're standing up for their places and their people. It's very powerful. So Shannon, it sounds like, you're saying you're getting a new plains organizer, people to bring more and more of the tribal groups together. Can you talk just for a moment about, I have a limited understanding of, I know certain federally recognized tribes in the US have their own tribal constitutions. Are you seeing more of those groups making their own laws that are connecting to rights of nature, or are they more amplifying their own worldviews and connecting that way, or a bit of both?
I think it's sort of both. I mean, so the Plain States, for those of you in Australia, are, they're kind of in the middle. They tend to be kind of flat. But Oklahoma in particular, which is Oklahoma is home to 37 recognized, federally recognized tribes, which is a lot. And there have been all kinds of sort of, legal cases about what kind of environmental protection that affords them. But tribes in the United States have been using things like land back movement. I don't know if you use that or know what that is, but essentially what sounds kind of scary, it sounds like they want to send everybody packing because they want their land back. And what they really want is that whole, Indigenous lands and Indigenous hands, because they are the best caretakers. It isn't saying everybody has to get off, but it is saying decisions are best made by the first peoples of these places, these, following these original instructions and this traditional cosmology, which of course, I'm sure somebody has pointed out, 80% of the world's biodiversity is, being in the hands of, and so wherever you strengthen Indigenous sovereignty, you strengthen protections for the land. And so Oklahoma, which is at once a fossil fuel epicenter, it's now home to, fracking earthquakes, the first man-made earthquakes in the world. It's the convergence of the largest convergence of pipelines anywhere in the United States. So it's pretty much the fossil fuel industry kind of dominates, not kind of, literally dominates the politics of the state of Oklahoma and other plain states, where tribes have a lot of power individually to come up with their own solutions, but also to come together to support one another's visions, and to, if other groups and other tribes are interested in rights of nature, this Plains project that we're doing, and I'll send a little video link to a 7-minute sort of video about what that looks like, and you'll get to see Casey Camp Hornick, and the work that she's leading in the Plains, which we're so excited and proud to support in this way. So you have a legal opportunity. You have this rich tradition in Oklahoma that doesn't exist necessarily everywhere, of tribal communities coming together, and it's just more like sort of ingrained in the culture than it is inside. It's more visible than other places, and you have these. So you have this fossil fuel industry, which is both separating tribes, but also bringing folks together. And so that's what we're trying to see. And that's why it has to come together with just transition strategies, because you can't tell people, no fossil fuels for you. What are you going to do for a living without having something that is an alternative? And Indigenous people have really been leading the way for that too. So this is an opportunity to bring all those strategies together in a way where land back and rights of nature really are very well connected in terms of they may be different strategies, but they're all rooted also in Indigenous sovereignty, in a state where that is, where that is a really big piece of the puzzle for people in Oklahoma and tribes in Oklahoma.
Sounds fantastic. Yes, please do send through any links or videos. Just before we start to wrap up, Shannon, you touched on, and I was already mentioning in a previous chat, this idea of many Indigenous groups, of course, have a completely different legal tradition to what we would call Western law. And unfortunately, European colonization for 500 years has convinced everyone that law is Western law. Can you talk for a minute about something that's dear to my heart, which is the notion that rights-based work is very important to some extent, but in fact, many traditions look at their laws of obligation to care for a place, it's not framed in a rights-based way, but it does translate into a rights-based way today. And just quickly, one of the amazing Indigenous elders I work very closely with, Mary Graham, who I'm sure many Aussies who are listening today know of her work. She's a truly amazing human being, but she articulates what she calls a sort of pan-Aboriginal philosophy, which involves a very deep law of obligation to these place-based laws. She has a difficulty with some of the rights-based language, but that's a more nuanced and detailed discussion. So can you talk a bit about what you see as a non-Indigenous person in the US? How do Indigenous people fit with rights-based approaches? I'm genuinely curious. Are they comfortable with it because it's a strong influence, or do they hold other ideas of what law is?
Well, it's interesting because you were just talking with Osprey, and Casey and I had our first deep discussion at an event that Osprey sponsored of 100 Global Women, where she'd heard me and others, Natty and others, talking about the rights of nature. And she thought, oh, who needs that? And somebody overheard her and told me that that Casey was, sort of poo-pooing rights of nature. And I don't know, I guess I cornered her in the bathroom. But we had our first conversation there, and I said, I really want to know what are your feelings? What are you afraid of? And, Western law is never been kind to, Indigenous people in this. Every treaty has been broken. So when you start off talking about how the law is going to come and save you, there's tons of resistance. And so the first tribes that came forward to recognize rights of nature and say, we're throwing this, we're turning this upside down. This is our values, our system, our cosmology, our responsibility system put for y'all in a Western framework, which is also what the Wanganui people said. This is in some ways more for you than for us. We know what our relationship is. And, you know, that making it sort of okay first to own it, I think was, and say, we're doing this ourselves. We're not waiting for, you know, a bunch of, you know, white or non-Indigenous lawyers to come and save the day. Some of them are, of course, and white allies like myself, but they really had to own it, and that's still happening, and it's still working its way, and not every tribe is there yet. That's, you know, but it is one powerful way that more and more tribes are looking to really move forward, not just a legal change, but that culture shift for everybody, and to bring everybody into that connection, that humans aren't separate from nature. As Casey would say, we are nature protecting itself.
That's wonderful. No, I really appreciate that. And hearing people, you know, in Indigenous tribes, they're saying, we're just going to turn this on its head. We're going to own it. And we're going to explain back to you guys how our system works. I think that's absolutely what a lot of non-Indigenous people want to hear is, what does it look like for you? What can we all do together? So yeah, very cool. Time goes fleeting on today's marathon of rights of nature issues. Shannon Biggs, I'm going to say a huge thank you. I can see the fabulous Shrishti Bajpai has already joined us from India. So, wow. We're going to move now from Turtle Island over to...
Thank you, and hello, Shrishti. Thanks, Michelle. Great to see you.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Shannon. And please do send through any informational sharings. I've popped the website for movement rights into the link. And yeah, look forward to chatting further with you. And we've got a lot of plans to have more symposia and forums here in Australia next year. So we'll be dragging you guys in online again very soon, I hope. Thanks so much.